I'm Matt O'Connor from the O'Connor Law Firm PC here in Kansas City, Missouri, here today to talk to you about the Takings Clause. The Takings Clause is part of the Fifth Amendment. Now, if you thought the Fifth Amendment was only your right to remain silent and the right to a grand jury indictment and the protection against double jeopardy, you would be incorrect. There's actually quite a bit of information and protections afforded by the Fifth Amendment. Now, as that relates to the Takings Clause, the reason it's called the Takings Clause is it prevents the government from taking your property, a citizen's property, without just compensation. Now, that's the part that gets tricky sometimes. What's just compensation and what is that government taking? Now, the most obvious example that you can probably identify with and understand very simply is that, for example, if the government wants to make a highway and they need someone's property in order to expand the highway or to make the highway, the government is entitled through what's called eminent domain, the government's ability to do that because it needs to do that for a governmental function. They can take that property, but they have to pay the citizen the fair market value of that property. And that's why it's called the Takings Clause, because it specifically states, let me read this to you, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So what that means is what it says. A lot of people like to spin things and interpret the Constitution. I'm kind of a big believer in actually just reading it word for word and enforcing it strictly as it is written. So it says, nor shall private property, so private property, number one, be taken for public use. So there's two more, taken, and it has to be public use. And then there's a fourth, without just compensation. So private property taken for public use without just compensation. Those are four things. Those are the elements, like in baking a cake. Those are the ingredients that make the cake. You can't have it without flour and sugar. So what is the Takings Clause? It's the clause of the Fifth Amendment that prevents the government from taking your property without just compensation, and it has to be for public use. So, for example, let's say that blue T-shirts are now illegal, just for an odd example. The government passes, the legislature passes a law, a statute that says blue T-shirts are now illegal, and you have blue T-shirts. And those are now illegal. Is that a Takings Clause violation? Well, there's been some case law that suggests that it is, because the government is taking your property, your private property, your blue T-shirt, and they need to give you compensation, whatever the fair market value of that is. So is that for a public use, though? That's the tricky part, where if you strictly interpret it, why are they taking, well, what's the public use? I suppose the outlawing of blue T-shirts would be the public use or the public reason, the rationale. Who knows, just using that as an example. But if you lose your property, your blue T-shirt, the government is supposed to compensate you. That public use part of it gets to be a little bit tricky, and that's, where there's vagueness comes in lawyers. There's litigation, lawsuits, where the government is represented by the Attorney General's office often, and then a private citizen is represented by a private attorney. And that's where you get into litigation. And I think the Takings Clause is going to become more and more, not controversial, but more relied upon as our government seeks to expand its influence over spheres of behavior that may end up taking away property. That's something to keep an eye on as the case law develops. So again, the Takings Clause is what? It is the taking of your private property for a public use with just compensation. And the government is required to give you fair compensation. What is that fair compensation? That's, again, just compensation usually probably means fair market value. What would the property bring on the open market? How much could you sell your blue T-shirt for? Is it $4? If you've got 100 blue T-shirts, is that $400? Does the government have to pay you that? Yes, they do. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to have a lawyer to enforce your ability to protect your own constitutional rights, which just seems odd, doesn't it? You have to pay a lawyer to protect what was already there in the first place. But it's the world we live in these days, unfortunately. So again, the Takings Clause, that's what it says. I encourage you to read the entire Fifth Amendment, really all of the Bill of Rights. And they're called that because they are our rights. They were amended to the Constitution because people were afraid the government might take away your rights. Your right to free speech, the First Amendment. Your right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. The right to be free from having the government make you quarter troops, that's the Third Amendment, not very often used. And then there's the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, of course, which are very important for generally criminal procedure and things of that nature. But the Takings Clause, active and alive, still there since it was first enacted, still enforced, and literally prevents the government from taking your property without just compensation. I'm Matt O'Connor. Thanks for listening.